have you ever heard of the Hui people?
That question got the attention of Brother Kevin and his wife. They were visiting the People's Republic of China, determining whether to return there as gospel workers. A fellow worker told them about the 13 million Hui people in China, and Kevin started asking questions.
So how many churches are there among them? And he said, none. How many believers are there among these 13 million Muslims? He said, we think there's a few hundred in this area where we are right now having this conversation. At the time, he said there aren't any. Last question, how many organizations, families, churches, individuals are committed to working with the ones in this area? And he said 0.
Jesus never promised his followers an easy path. In fact, he told his disciples that the world would hate them. He sent them out as sheep among wolves. Jesus' words came true in the life of the apostles, and they're still coming true today in the lives of his followers around the world. Join host Todd Nettleton as we hear their inspiring stories and learn how we can help. Right now on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.
Welcome again to the Voice of the Martyrs Radio. My name is Todd Nettleton. We are in the studio today in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, with another of our one-name guests. If you are a longtime listener to VOM Radio, you know we often have people who don't necessarily want their full name on the internet and on the radio because they are involved in gospel work in closed places, hostile and restricted nations. Our guest today is Brother Kevin. He is a gospel worker who has spent more than a decade living and serving in a predominantly Muslim area of the country of China. So we are going to hear from him. Brother Kevin, welcome to Voice of the Martyrs Radio.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is great to have you here. I like to start out, as we are introducing you, to go back to the beginning. So how did God pick you up out of an American context and draw you, call you to go and serve among Muslims in China?
I think a key part of my journey toward being overseas is just the fact that I grew up in a home where the gospel was not central. My family are moral people and law-abiding people and very hardworking people. But just the culture of our home was not rooted in the things of the gospel. And in fact, I lived in an area of the country where for my entire high school career, time in college, and first few years out of college, didn't meet a single believer.
Wow.
So by the time I reached age 25, I was already in a career in finance and was living what I had always thought would be the most satisfying kind of life you could live. I was making more money than I could spend, and I couldn't shake this feeling that I was just empty on the inside. So I made a promise to myself at the age of 25. I said, if there is a reason, a supernatural reason why I'm here in this world, I'm going to do everything I can to try to find it. And over the next 6 to 12 months, the Lord really began to work. Because it wasn't really a prayer, it was more of a promise to myself. The Lord began to work, and I made the decision to go to grad school. So I had to start reading all these classics. And one of the classics I had to read was Dante's Inferno. I got to a point in Dante's Inferno where, like most readers, I saw the people in the lowest levels of the Inferno as just being hideous people that definitely deserved to be there. And, I'm so glad I'm not like them. But when I started to look at the people that were actually in the less severe levels of the Inferno, I saw a lot of commonalities between me and them. And it hit me one day that maybe if there's a God, he and I are not on good terms. And maybe I am like these people that are in the Inferno. And so for the first time, I prayed, if you're there, show me how I don't have to go to that place. It all changed for me one day. I was living alone, had a boombox that I used to listen to classic rock on. And when I moved it from one place in my apartment to the other, I bumped into the tuner knob on the side, and it spun it off of the classic rock station I was listening to, and I turned it on, and Chuck Swindoll was on. And when he was done, Tony Evans came on. And after his show, John MacArthur came on. And it was through the radio ministry of those men that I heard the gospel. And I was low-hanging fruit. I mean, I just needed to hear it. I just needed to know, what am I supposed to imitate Jesus? Like, what's the point here? And it was clear that the cross was the point of it all, and that he had conquered death in the resurrection and invites all people to himself. And I was in right away. The next month, I read this verse from Romans 15. Paul, the Apostle Paul writes, "Thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation." And I read that, and it was like I was just grabbed by it. I thought, I'm single. I had probably had a poor understanding of the value of family at that point. Basically, I would have said something like, I don't have strong connections. Nobody's going to miss me, was kind of what I was thinking. Maybe there are people that not only didn't hear the gospel by the time they got to age 25, but they never get a chance to hear the gospel. That's who I need to go to. And so I basically began the process of moving toward that.
Even just like a month after you were saved.
Yes.
Wow.
It was almost, I mean, my spiritual formation happened at seminary as a new believer. I was reading the Bible for the first time as I was going through an MDiv program.
Wow.
So really special time.
We're talking this week on Voice of the Martyrs Radio with Brother Kevin. He is a gospel worker who has spent more than a decade among a predominantly Muslim group in China. As you will hear, we are changing Kevin's voice to protect his identity. We're only calling him Brother Kevin. That is intentional, not to give away too much information about him. Kevin, talk about moving to China. Obviously, it's a communist country. It's a closed nation. You can't show up and say, hey, I want to plant a church. What was that process like for you?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize for my family and I, there were aspects of the story that were supernatural, just obviously from the Lord. And there were aspects of the story that were pretty mundane. You know, I mean, there's missionary heroes like John G. Patton, who appears to have discovered his call to the South Pacific by reading an almanac. You know, and then you have others like the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus, who has an almost irrepeatable kind of experience. We had both of those things. My wife and I did. A big part of our journey was we met at seminary, and we both separately made the decision, and then we aligned on that decision, that we were not going to unite ourselves to somebody in marriage that was not also sensing a call to the nations. And that allowed us to avoid a lot of problems that we saw others around us running into. And we've continued to see that over the decades. So I think that was the first thing. There was a World Missions Center at our seminary where I would go probably almost every week. I would go in there and just learn about UPGs and began to understand the different blocks, religious blocks, and to sort of think through, like, how might I fit in that sort of a context. And then a really, mundane thing happened. One of our friends from seminary started working at a small missions agency and said, we send students to difficult places, and I feel like I'm thinking about you guys leading one of these teams. And I asked where the trip was going that she was thinking about us for, and she said, India. And I said, whoa. I said, well, I've been to Mexico once. And
I'm ready to lead a team.
Yeah. And my wife's been to Canada twice, She said, yeah, I know. And maybe to make it a little bit more challenging, I'm not thinking about you going as students. I'm thinking about you leading the team. And so I told her, I said, "Sister, we'll pray about this. We'll actually fast and pray about this, but you probably ought to keep looking." But as God would do over and over again in our lives, that just surrender of in a season of fasting and prayer, and I'm sitting here right now with my hands open, my palms up, to kind of demonstrate the posture of our hearts, that the Lord takes those moments and does really special things. And he began to birth in us a love for the people of India and a willingness to go to what would prove to be probably the most difficult experience of our marriage. Not because of any sort of regrettable things happening, just because of the resistance to the gospel that we experienced in villages there. Anyway, we ended up going, and we had been there for about 2 months and had seen about 1,000 people come to Christ.
Wow.
And our hosts approached us and said, "We want you to come back and help us with this massive problem we have. We've got 1,000 believers in 80 different villages. We've got to organize them into fellowships, and I need you to come help us do it." And I said, "What about the language?" He said, "Don't worry, we'll just have translators." And we said, okay. So my wife and I go into this little restaurant, the Pink Panther restaurant. It was one of these ones where you walk into in India and you order, and then they go out and kill the chicken and prepare it. So we had like a couple of hours to talk. And I said, "Babe, what do you think?" And she said, "I can't really say I feel a clear call to this place, but I want to hear where you are on it." And I said, "I think this could be a phenomenal ministry opportunity. We've already been here for 3 months, 2 months. We're a part of these people coming to Christ. It sounds incredible. However, there's one place that when we were on the airplane flying here, I thought about, and I think we need to visit that place before we make a decision." And she said, "Well, what place is that?" And I said, "China." I said, "I was looking out to the west as we were flying down here and thinking, God's doing something there, and I'm not sure if perhaps we might be a part of that." So we said, okay. I was a teacher, so I had my summers off. The next summer, we supported the ministry in India financially, but we took our first trip to China. And we were in a remote area, and a long-term missionary was sitting in front of us. And we had been there for maybe 6 weeks at this point. And he turned around on the bus, and it was almost like what we call a DTR, a define the relationship kind of talk. He said, "All right, we can all see what's happening here. You like us, we like you. So what do you think about coming here and joining us in this work among these peoples here?" And he was talking about a particular minority group there. And we just told him honestly, like, yeah, it's been great being among them. I'm not sure that's where the Lord's leading us, but my wife and I had a high appreciation for a sense of calling. And I'll even talk about what that is if you want to ask me about it in a minute, like how we understand that, how we've interpreted that. And the way I phrased it was something like, yeah, I'm just not sure that we feel called in that direction. Clearly there's a need, and we probably have freedom to go in that direction, but I'm not sure I sense a call. And then he said, "Have you ever heard of the Hui people?" And we said, No, what's the story with them? He said, "Well, the Hui are about 13 million strong in the country." And I said, "Oh, wow, there's probably a lot of people working with them." And he said, "No, there's not." So how many churches are there among them? And he said, "None." And we said, "Wow. Well,
Wow.
How many believers are there among these 13 million Muslims?" He said, "We think there's a few hundred in this area where we are right now having this conversation at the time." He said, "There aren't any." And I looked at my wife, and she looked at me, and I said, "Wow." So last question, how many organizations, families, churches, individuals are committed to working with the ones in this area? And he said 0. And that's when we felt like the call came. From that point on, we were laser focused on getting ourselves back there to work with the Hui, and got back to our hometown. I got a call probably 6 months later from a brother who said, "Hey, you were in my city several months ago, and you came into the post office." And I said, I said, oh, yeah, I remember that. I said, yeah, I was there. He said, well, you talked to somebody in the post office about your ministry and your plans. I went in there a couple of months later, and that person remembered what you had said and connected us. I'm going to work with the Hui. I'm leaving tomorrow.
Wow.
And we found out we were both being sent by the same org, and that would become the initial team in that area. And, we're still working with them now all these years later.
So when you moved there, did you set out to learn the Wei language? Did you set out to learn Mandarin, or both? Or how did you think about settling in and getting your feet on the ground?
I think it's important for us to realize you go in, especially as a Westerner, with a lot of ideals, a lot of idealism, and it's like, give me the hardest place with the hardest, most resistant people group and the hardest language. When you start wading into it, you realize there's nothing ungodly about maybe making some incremental goals. And I think God gave us grace and wisdom to make some of those decisions. Like the first one was, my wife told me, so I don't think God has made me to live in the bush somewhere. And I was like, okay, well, let's just go ahead and say we're going to be in an urban area. Let's go ahead and make that decision. Doesn't matter what people think. Doesn't matter if it's not the hardest. Let's see ourselves in an urban area. That decision alone helped us with the language problem. Because for the Hui, most urban Hui speak Mandarin Chinese unless they're talking about religious things, in which case they will bring in Arabic and Persian words.
Interesting.
So if you learn Mandarin, you can go a long way in relationships, but you've got to learn kind of a 0.2 language as well, so that you can discuss spiritual matters. So we went in, we just went into a typical Mandarin program at a small college, got tutors, lived in an immersion setting, so nobody else spoke English in our neighborhood, and that forced us to go out and learn it.
How long did it take?
To have unhelpful gospel conversations, probably a couple of months. To have more helpful ones, probably 9 to 12 months.
Okay.
And then to really be able to take out the word, be looking at Chinese pictographs, and be able to work through a passage with somebody, probably a couple of years, something like that. That's where being able to go in as a full-time student was a huge asset, which may or may not be possible anymore. But at the time, that was a strategic move.
Were there some times in those early months where you thought, we are in way over our heads, we should probably go home? Or, man, I just don't want to be here anymore? What were some of the things that brought about those kind of times, those kind of challenges?
I think this is where a theology of calling comes in, because if you make the decision to go to a really hard place like we were in, and that decision was based only on, I'm just being obedient to the Great Commission, or I think God's given us freedom to go wherever, in the worst moments, you're probably going to be able to justify leaving. We were not able to do that because we went back to that day bouncing down the mountain where that long-term missionary told us about the Hui. And from that point on, even to today, even while I'm sitting here with you, I do not feel freedom to move away from the Hui people. It feels like disobedience to me. There's a call that feels binding on me. And I think that kept us there during the hardest seasons. It's a combination of things, the over involvement of the authorities in your daily life. The being conspicuous is hard if you're introverted. People staring at you, eventually you begin to understand what they're saying about you, which is difficult sometimes. Some of the conditions are frustrating and hard. And then you just have some really bad moments sometimes too, where you recognize, wow, in 6 months, it doesn't seem like the needle's moved much. And you ask questions like, are we even doing any good here?
We're talking this week on Voice of the Martyrs Radio with Brother Kevin. He is a gospel worker who spent more than a decade working in China. Kevin, there are VOM radio listeners who maybe right at this moment are wrestling with that sense of call. Am I really called? Are you calling me overseas? What? Talk to them for a second about grabbing a hold of that, about praying through to clarity on that. Just give them some advice as they're in that stage.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for asking. I think that's a really important question that I wish somebody had teased out for me a little bit more before I was walking through it. The strain of evangelicalism that I was born again into had a very clear understanding of calling, and it was very objective. I do think it lacked some necessary nuance that I hope I'll be able to bring out here in a few minutes. But basically, I think we want to recognize God does call, and maybe to use some other language there, he summons or he sends people. One thing I want to just celebrate is that he does that in a lot of different ways, and he does it in a mysterious place that's in our integrated personhood. In other words, I don't think God usually calls in a way that our eardrums pick up the frequency. It's in a different place in us, that a place where the sensitivity is honed through walking in fellowship with him, walking in fellowship with other believers, by God's grace, doing our best to respond in obedience promptly to what we see in the Word. All of this, I think, contributes to what we call walking in the Spirit. And I think that's where we have to be. If Christ and the gospel is just one of many compartments in your life, I think the whole issue of calling is going to be an exercise in frustration. There really needs to be a posture of the heart that is one of surrender. Christ is not one of many compartments. He is in every aspect of life, the one I'm seeking to honor, please, glorify, hear from, that sort of thing. So when it comes to the issue of calling, I think recognize that God can call us to ministry initiatives through conversations on a bus, like it was for us, through reading an almanac, like it was for John G. Patton, through a sermon on Sunday morning at your local church in the West, through reading the Word, through a prophetic utterance by somebody you'll never meet again. It can happen in a whole lot of different ways. But I do think, let's go to 1 Thessalonians 5. I think this is a good place to ground this in something that's healthy and biblical. Almost Paul's last words in that letter are, "Do not despise prophetic utterances, but test everything." And I think I want to have an open mind at what God's leading me to this morning, what God's leading me to long term, but I want to test that. And I think the two places we want to get in the habit of testing that are the Word and community. If you're not willing to test your sense of calling with the elders at your church, the pastors at your church, trusted leaders in your small group, your Sunday school class, your parachurch ministry, whatever it is, if you're not willing to process that with them, even to the point where they might say, "I just don't see it, Kevin," then I think you're not really testing that. It needs to be processed in community, and to let those who know you and can affirm that sense of calling or question that sense of calling speak into that process. I think that's a real key.
That's great advice from Brother Kevin. I hope you'll respond to what you've heard today on Voice of the Martyrs Radio. Number one, by making sure that Jesus is number one in your life, the reason that you do everything. Number two, by asking the Lord how he wants you to serve and to build his kingdom. And number three, by serving in your church, developing a community of fellow believers, humbly exploring together how God is calling you to serve him. This conversation about calling has been so helpful. We never got around to talking much about how God is at work in China and about Brother Kevin's ministry to the Hui people. So next week, we're going to pick this conversation back up. If you missed any of today's program, you can listen at vomradio.net. That's our website. You can also find the Voice of the Martyrs Radio wherever you listen to podcasts. Maybe you know someone who is really wrestling with what God's will is for their life. I hope you'll visit vomradio.net, send them a link to this conversation. Then be sure you're back with us next week right here on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.